In a secluded wooden house deep within desolate fields, the body of Samuel Johnson, a man considered by the entire town to be a kind old man, was found beneath the rotting floorboards. But this wasn't just a simple murder case. As investigators delved deeper into the dark secrets of the Johnson family, a horrifying truth emerged. Samuel was not the man everyone thought he was. His years of hidden, perverse behavior with his two granddaughters revealed a chilling reality that left people shaken. What truly happened in that house? And why did this seemingly kind grandfather meet such a tragic end? These questions are slowly being answered, but the truth will leave anyone in utter shock. The quiet village, hidden secrets in the shadows. Nestled between rolling mountains and vast fields, the small village where the Johnson family lived felt forgotten by the world. A place where time seemed to stand still, where gentle summer breezes drifted through the quiet streets, and the biting cold of winter wrapped everything in a blanket of stillness. The old houses, made of oak and stone, stood proudly among vibrant purple flower gardens, appearing untouched by time. Nothing much ever happened here. Life moved slowly, almost stiflingly calm, as if nothing could disturb the tranquility. And in that silence, dark secrets found it easy to hide. The Johnson family, seemingly perfect from the outside, was no exception. Beneath the surface of their happy facade lay buried secrets, deeds that no one in the village could have ever imagined. The darkness veiled a horrifying truth, waiting to be uncovered. Samuel Johnson, a respected man or a monster in the shadows? Samuel Johnson, a war veteran, was admired by the locals. At over 70, he lived quietly in a wooden house hidden behind ancient oak trees. This house had seen him through the ups and downs of life, from his youth fighting in the brutal Vietnam War to the years spent mourning the loss of his beloved wife. Despite the passage of time, his home remained the only place where Samuel felt secure. Every morning, he could be seen sitting on the porch swing, slowly sipping his hot coffee while watching the world go by. To the outside world, Samuel was the perfect picture of calm and morality, a symbol of serenity. No one could have imagined that behind that peaceful face lay a monstrous secret. The man the village affectionately called the kind old man was far from the person they thought he was. Emily and Lily, innocent girls and the door to hell. Emily and Lily, Samuel's granddaughters, were girls in the bloom of youth. Emily, the elder at 16, had golden hair that shone like the morning sun and always carried a bright smile. Lily, the younger at 14, had gentle green eyes that mirrored the autumn sky, full of youthful mischief and curiosity. Every weekend, the girls eagerly visited their grandfather, helping him tend the garden or simply listening to his old war stories. To the two girls, their grandfather represented safety and love, a refuge they could turn to when life wore them down. Their visits to Samuel became an essential part of their routine. On summer afternoons, their laughter filled the backyard, painting a picture of joy and peace. But behind that carefree facade were moments of unspeakable pain that neither girl dared to voice. The perverse acts they were forced to endure in the terrifying silence of night haunted them. They were not drawn into their grandfather's arms for protection, but to have their innocence stolen in a never-ending nightmare. Samuel, with his cold eyes and dark actions, turned their innocent visits into an enduring horror. John Johnson, the strict father in his undying love for his daughters. John, Samuel's only son, was a tough and determined man, well respected in the village for his hard work and sense of responsibility. To John, family meant everything, especially his two daughters, Emily and Lily. Every weekend, without fail, he would take them to visit their grandfather, even though he himself wasn't particularly close to his father. There was always a distance between John and Samuel, partly due to their age difference, but mostly because of Samuel's secretive and reserved nature. What John didn't know, however, was that the love he had for his daughters had unwittingly pushed them into the arms of a monster. He failed to notice the strange behavior in Emily and Lily, the unusual silence, the avoidance of eye contact, and their restless, sleepless nights. John didn't realize that each time he left his daughters at their grandfather's house, they were enduring something no child should ever have to face. A picture-perfect family, a mask hiding crimes. From the outside, the Johnson family maintained the appearance of happiness and perfection. Neighbors admired the close connection between the generations. They had no idea that inside that small wooden house, real nightmares were taking place. The darkest secrets of a family were buried under a calm facade, waiting for the day they would be unearthed. The story of the Johnson family, with its stark contrast between appearance and reality, began to reveal a strange portrait of guilt and betrayal. And when the truth came out, it wasn't just the family that was shattered, the entire small village would have to face a nightmare they had never imagined. Heavy silence, unforeseen changes in the Johnson house. The Johnson household was now filled with an unnatural silence, as if a cold wind had crept into every corner, stifling all sound and emotion. The once joyful laughter of Emily and Lily was gone. Instead, the house had become a realm of quiet, with shadows silently surrounding every step. Emily, with her long, golden hair that used to flutter in the wind, was now only a shadow of her former self. Her eyes had become hollow, her gaze distant, as if she were trying to escape something inescapable. John would often watch Emily quietly from afar. He noticed that she no longer showed enthusiasm for the things she once loved. The books she used to read daily now collected dust on the shelves, and the piano she used to play every evening seemed forgotten. But what hurt John the most was the nameless fear in his daughter's eyes. Every time he approached her, Emily would avoid his gaze, her lips trembling but saying nothing. It was like an invisible knife cutting deep into John's heart, leaving him sleepless and full of worry. Lily, Emily's younger sister, once a ray of sunshine in the house, had also become withdrawn. Every time John asked her how she was, she would give short, clipped answers before quickly retreating, as if afraid that any words might reveal a terrifying secret. Restless nights, the encroaching darkness. John began to feel as though the endless nights were slowly consuming him. Every night, as the house grew quiet, his worries about his daughters would swell like a rising tide, pulling him into a sea of unending nightmares. The soft footsteps of Emily as she walked down the hallway, Lily's muffled sobs from the next room, it all pushed him to the brink of madness. On some nights, John would wake up, walk into Lily's room in the dim light, and find her curled up in the corner of her bed, trembling like a small bird just freed from the claws of a predator. Her eyes were filled with panic, as if she were trying to escape something she could never face. John had no idea what to do except sit quietly by her bed, watching his daughter with a pain that gnawed at his heart. He couldn't understand what was haunting her. Emily wasn't faring any better. Sometimes, John would find her standing at the window of her room, staring out into the backyard where she and Lily had once played so innocently with their grandfather. That place was now only a dark, haunting memory for Emily. She seemed to be trying to piece together the fragments of a peaceful life that had shattered, but to no avail. Lingering questions, the wall of silence between father and daughters. John couldn't bear the silence any longer. He needed to know what had happened. One Sunday morning, as the family sat around the breakfast table, John decided to confront Emily. He looked into his daughter's eyes, hoping to find answers in the gaze that had become so distant. "Emily, is something wrong?" John's voice was warm, but laced with undeniable concern. Emily paused, her hands trembling as she stirred her tea. She looked up, meeting her father's eyes for a brief moment. Her eyes were red, filled with unshed tears. But instead of revealing the truth, Emily simply shook her head weakly. "Nothing, Dad. I just haven't been sleeping well." John knew she was lying. It was painfully obvious. He could sense the fear in every word Emily spoke, as if she were desperately trying to hide a horrifying secret she couldn't bring herself to speak. Her lips were tightly sealed, as if opening them would cause the horror to spill out and drown the entire family. Lily wasn't any different. Whenever John asked her how she was doing, she would avoid his gaze, her small hands gripping the tablecloth as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Both of John's daughters were drowning in silence, and it left him feeling powerless. Faint signs, the predator's gaze. John's suspicions grew stronger each day. Every weekend, when he took his daughters to visit their grandfather, he sensed that something was off in the air. Samuel, the father John had once trusted, now seemed strangely distant. There were times when John would catch Samuel watching the girls closely, and something about the way he looked at them felt wrong. Samuel's gaze was no longer kind and loving, instead, it had grown cold and sharp, as if he were hiding something dark. John sensed an invisible tension whenever Samuel was near the girls. Every time they left their grandfather's house, Emily and Lily seemed more withdrawn, their eyes filled with fear. It drove John mad, but he didn't know what to do. He had no proof, only vague feelings he couldn't put into words. The confrontation, words sharper than knives. Samuel sat silently, his eyes gradually growing colder and more unpredictable. "John, what nonsense are you spouting? I never did anything wrong to my grandchildren." "Enough!" John shouted, his eyes blazing with fury. "I've seen the way you look at them, the way you hold them too long. You've abused our trust, and now you still dare to deny it." Samuel remained calm, but his eyes now gleamed with disdain. "You don't understand anything, John. You've let your imagination run wild. What you think is nothing more than a delusion." John stepped forward, standing right in front of Samuel. "I've heard enough. You've hurt my daughters, and you can't escape this." Samuel stared at John, his voice growing sharp and icy. "What can you do, John? Are you going to accuse me? Who will believe you? I've spent my life for this family, for this community. Who do you think will stand by you? I am your father, and you're accusing me of the worst things. No one will believe you." John felt the rage inside him explode. Samuel, the man he had once trusted and respected, now used his calm demeanor and authority to deny everything. His words cut deep, sharper than any blade, and John could no longer endure it. The irreversible moment, fury unleashed. John lost control. He lunged at Samuel, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him up from the chair. "I can't let you keep hurting my daughters. You've done the worst thing imaginable, and now you're going to pay for it." Samuel sneered, his eyes full of mockery. "What are you going to do, John? Kill me? You don't have the guts." Those words were the final spark that ignited the inferno inside John. All reason vanished. He swung his fist, landing a hard punch on Samuel's face, sending him crashing to the floor. Samuel groaned, but John felt nothing except the burning fury inside him. "You'll never hurt anyone again," John growled, his eyes blazing. He bent down and picked up a wooden rod nearby, an unintended weapon, but the only thing he could use to end this nightmare for his daughters. There was nothing left in John's mind but the overwhelming need for justice. Standing over Samuel, John gripped the wooden rod tightly, his eyes clouded with rage. Samuel, lying on the floor, looked up at him with panic in his eyes. No longer the strong, arrogant father, he was now a weak, desperate man clinging to life. "I'll give you what you deserve," John said, his voice trembling with anger. Without hesitation, John brought the rod down, striking Samuel's head with all his might. Samuel screamed, but John didn't stop. He continued to strike, again and again, until the room was filled with nothing but deathly silence. The aftermath, the price of rage. John stood there, staring down at Samuel's lifeless body. The wooden rod in his hand was covered in blood, and his heart still pounded with the fury that had consumed him. But now, as the rage subsided, only emptiness remained. John knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return, and his life would never be the same again. The room was now filled with an eerie, heavy silence, broken only by John's ragged breathing. The blood-stained wooden rod fell from his hand, landing on the floor with a hollow thud. Samuel, his father, the man he had once respected, now lay motionless at his feet, his body battered and broken by John's anger. Blood oozed from the wounds on Samuel's head, pooling on the wooden floor, creating a ghastly scene John would never forget. John stood there, his chest heaving with the mixture of emotions, anger, fear, and regret. What he had done wasn't just killing a man, it was shattering the family bond that had once existed. He had crossed the line of humanity, and now he had to face the consequences. A chilling coldness spread from John's blood-stained hands up to his head. His mind seemed paralyzed for a few minutes, unable to think of anything other than the panic seeping into him. He had killed someone. And not just anyone, he had killed his own father. If discovered, this would destroy his life, everything he had built, everything he had promised to protect. Panic sets in, a race against time. John looked down at Samuel's lifeless body. He knew he didn't have time to dwell on the situation. This body had to disappear, and fast. No one could know what had happened. At any cost, John had to cover up his crime before anyone found out. In his head, a flurry of questions raced. How would he hide the body? How could he avoid suspicion? John's hands trembled as he bent down to grab Samuel's shoulders. His father's body was no longer human, just a lifeless object. Heavy and cold, it seemed to resist John's every effort. He dragged the body across the floor, feeling each drop of blood hit the ground, leaving a clear trail. Every movement made John feel like he was dragging the immense weight of his guilt. The sound of the body scraping against the floor echoed in the quiet night, reminding him of the horror he had just committed. John's heart pounded faster, sweat poured from him, but he couldn't stop. There was no time to pause and reflect. He needed to act immediately. A hasty plan, concealing the crime. Samuel's wooden house was isolated from the rest of the village, which was an advantage for John. No one could hear the commotion, and no one knew he was there that night. But that didn't mean he could escape so easily. Every step had to be carefully calculated. John dragged Samuel's body into the small kitchen of the house, where he knew no one would accidentally walk in. The room grew darker, not just because of the dim light from the oil lamp, but because the smell of blood began to fill the air. John stopped for a moment, gasping for breath, and then bent down to find a thick blanket in the corner. He had to wrap the body, so no one could see the evidence. Layer by layer, the blanket covered Samuel's body, as if John were trying to bury his guilt beneath the fabric. He worked mechanically, not daring to think about what would happen next. After wrapping the body tightly, John stepped back, trying to think quickly. He needed to get the body out of the house without leaving any trace. But how? His eyes landed on the back door of the house, leading to a small forest behind it. It was the only place he could think of at the moment. No one would find the body if he hid it in the forest, not immediately, at least. A path with no way back, the journey to hide the body. John opened the back door, staring out into the quiet night. The pale moonlight cast long shadows over the dense trees. He knew he had to act quickly, before anyone realized what had happened. With all the strength he had left, John dragged Samuel's body outside. The path into the forest felt endless in the dark. Every step John took felt heavy, as if his shoes were being weighed down by the burden of his crime. The wind blew through the trees, but it couldn't cool the fire raging in his heart. John felt like he was racing against time, and time wasn't on his side. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John found a deep spot in the forest, far enough that no one would stumble upon it. This was where Samuel would remain forever. John dug a small grave, his hands shaking with every shovelful of dirt, and with each strike, he felt the weight of his fate grow heavier. When the grave was deep enough, John placed Samuel's body inside, his own body collapsing with exhaustion. He knew this wasn't just burying a body, it was burying his past, the memories of the father he once loved, and the person he used to be. The consequences of justice, a crime that cannot be hidden. After covering the grave with dirt, John stood still for a moment, looking down at the nameless grave. Sweat and tears mixed on his face, but nothing could wash away the harsh reality he now faced. Everything he had once believed in had been destroyed, and now, he was left with only one grim truth: he had killed his father and buried his body in the darkness of the forest. But John knew that no matter how deeply he buried this crime, it would haunt him forever. Every time he looked into his daughter's eyes, he would remember why he had done this. And every time he passed Samuel's house, he would relive this night, the night he became a murderer. John returned to his own house, the weight of his actions heavy on every step. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But he had to keep going, not for himself, but for Emily and Lily. He had to protect them from the shadows of the past, even if it meant living with the guilt for the rest of his life. Community reactions, shock and division. When news of the case broke, the community where the Johnson family lived was left in shock and disbelief. No one could have imagined that such a horrific crime could take place in the heart of their peaceful village. Samuel, who had always been considered a kind and respected man, was now exposed as a monster. The dark truth about his relationship with his granddaughters left the entire village outraged. However, John's actions sparked a wide range of opinions. Some villagers felt sympathy for him, viewing John as a desperate father trying to protect his children from the cruelty of his own father. They understood that John had faced an intense psychological battle and that killing Samuel wasn't out of malice, but because he had no other choice. For these people, John was a victim of circumstance and deserved forgiveness. On the other hand, not everyone shared this view. Some in the community believed that no matter how horrific Samuel's actions were, John still had no right to take his father's life. They felt that only the law could punish a criminal, and John's decision to kill his father was unacceptable. "No one has the right to take another person's life," one villager remarked. Even if Samuel was terrible, John should have let the law handle it. These differing viewpoints created a rift in the community, turning the small village into a tense and conflicted place. Meanwhile, John's family, particularly Emily and Lily, became the center of attention. Neighbors no longer looked at them with admiration but rather with pity and a haunting awareness of the tragedy they had endured. Lingering pain, irreversible consequences. The case of John Johnson left not only legal consequences but also deep emotional scars on the community. The dark secrets that were uncovered ensured the village would never be the same. For John, he had to face the guilt and pain for the rest of his life. Despite killing his father to protect his daughters, he could not erase the horrific memories left behind by Samuel's abuse. Emily and Lily, though freed from their grandfather's torment, would forever be haunted by what had happened. The betrayal from a close family member and their father's crime would always be part of their lives. These wounds could not easily be healed, and the Johnson family would never return to the way they once were. The trial and the sentence divided judgment. The case of John Johnson eventually went to trial, drawing widespread attention. The key question during the trial was whether John was a cold-blooded murderer or simply a man pushed to the edge by unbearable circumstances. Throughout the trial, John didn't try to justify his actions. He admitted to killing his father but maintained that the sole reason was to protect his daughters from Samuel's horrific crimes. The trial became a focal point for both the local community and the broader public. While many sympathized with John, believing he had been driven to his breaking point and acted out of desperation, others insisted that the law could not be bypassed and that John still had to be held accountable for murder. In the end, the court reached a verdict: John was convicted of second-degree murder. Although his actions were deemed to have been driven by a valid reason, the law could not excuse taking another person's life. The sentence was relatively lenient, 15 years in prison, but it served as a reminder that no one is above the law, no matter how noble their motives may be. The aftermath: a community haunted by darkness. The case closed, but the repercussions continued to haunt not just the Johnson family but also the village where they lived. The Johnson family had lost their father and grandfather, but more than that, they had lost their familial bond. The emotional scars left on Emily and Lily were deep, and they would never fully heal. The community, too, could not return to the peaceful state it once knew. The case had exposed the horrifying truth that dark secrets can exist within even the most trusted families. Villagers began to reflect on the idea that the worst tragedies can happen behind the closed doors of a neighbor's home, without anyone realizing. The anger and pain from the case left a lasting mark on the community. Questions about right and wrong, justice and compassion, continued to linger in the minds of those who had followed the case. Some believed John shouldn't be punished, as he had done what was necessary to protect his family. But others argued that no matter how dire the situation, murder could never be justified. An unforgettable aftermath. The Johnson case was a bitter reminder that sometimes the truth is too cruel to bear. It left the village with a lesson: not everything is as it seems, and sometimes the darkest secrets lie within the walls of our own homes. This event permanently changed how the community viewed the Johnson family, and their own lives.